We also mentioned that as there was a craft-oriented economy with handmade goods that propelled our nation, now events happen. All of these economic systems came as a result of some crash that happened somewhere. Something dramatic happened in our lifetime, in our world. And that caused then a change in the economy. When that happened, the union movement per se, also, one of them ceased to exist as a predominant and something else was born. And it was born to fit that economy and to fit the needs of that economy and the people that worked there. In essence, the unions had to reorganize. The unions organized here, basically coming from Europe as guilds predominantly. They had to reorganize here when the memberships dropped and handmade goods disappeared. When we went into service in the 70s, the same thing happened. What are we struggling with today? In service, you know, service, I think there's 165 million people that work in service, and only 5% of them are unionized. And of that 5%, probably 90% are public employees. And that was an easy organize. But what I started to find is we had to be reborn again. And it's happening again. This time, the time frame is shorter. The time frame is from 1970 to roughly 2000. Shorter time frames, these economies, and the speed starts to change things. So the unions hardly were adjusting from losing all the factories. And for those of you who drove through our state and our city, you could see some of the examples of that last night. And it doesn't mean that Michigan is disappearing. Far from it. We think that we will be here when it's all over and done with. We'll be stronger, and we'll have things here that will replace things that disappeared. But that means the union movement has to move much faster to get someplace. Part of what we're doing is to be able to move faster. With that thought in mind, let's kind of look at my information box and what caused all of a sudden a change towards a new economy. Well, my second bullet point is probably the most important thing. The Industrial Revolution happened. You heard them talk about it when we walked through that machine shop yesterday. That machine shop came as a result of the Industrial Revolution starting in Europe and continuing its cycle through America and around the world, period. When that happened, we started building factories. When we started building factories, we started changing the dynamics of everything. The first change was that we moved from a local market, that is Detroit, Los Angeles, and Boston, we moved to a national market. To support a factory and the sale of those goods that came out very fast and very quickly, we had to sell more broadly. And with that came national transportation systems, needs for all kinds of things. And the union movement went through quite a crisis at that point, which I want to talk about. It also said that skill became less important. Remember, the power of the union movement that existed in the craft was based upon scarcity. The scarcity of my skill. And all of a sudden I had a factory run by what? People who had no skills. So the first thing I have to do is do you have all your little signs out? I'm glad you have your signs out. I have to dispose of some of you. And Ty, I think I made you a trainee, right? Okay. Yeah. Well, this should sober you up. Ty,
and he was drinking last night.
You're done. We don't need any more apprentices. We don't need any more journeymen. Why? You're going to work in a factory. You're going to work for not federal minimum wage because we didn't have it. You're going to work for a very small amount of cents per hour. We don't need you anymore. Now, in addition, I also know I don't need too many more apprentices either. I'm sorry. You're gone too. Now, I know what will happen to him in the scheme of mass production in factories. What happens to a person who had skill going into a factory? There are the questions we have to ask in terms of the transition for unions from one economy to another. Obviously, the leadership styles changed. If the leadership style was one of the most skilled and gifted, was the leader, he or she, but mostly he, then what was to be the replacement? What style do we need? It depends on the power source. What power did the unions have to have at this point to propel themselves to success? That will define what kind of leadership they need to drive a new engine. You'll notice I said family control of skill distribution started to lessen. I just got rid of 2 members of the family. So this is the kind of thing that drove, and the engines that drove those kinds of changes. The interesting thing is that during this time period, which is what we're going to look at this afternoon, the steam engine came about. The steam engine became very, very important to all of your successes if you worked in a utility. It was a driver. It was a driver that drove machinery. It was a driver that, in effect, employed people. It was a driver that defined an entirely new industry called utilities. And a lot of things got added to it up to this day called green utilities. Didn't even think of them in those days. Now, let's take a visit for a moment and find out why I just destroyed my friend Mr. Mills and I destroyed my friend Mr. Turner. Let's follow the skill of the hand of a unionized worker. And let's go back to Europe, to the guilds. But I remind you that there were major portions of the world that contributed to the skills that we don't have a lot of documentation on. And up to this point, it's probably not been given the due credit it has to drive change. Those were from Africa, Asia, and South America. And yes, they were there, but one of the major things that was documented was what happened in Europe with the guilds. The guilds came to America. They came with the expansion. And they became the craft unions. But now, as we start to go into the mass production era, or into this crossover period where we're going to factories, all of a sudden, what happened to Mike? Well, Mike, there were 2 things that could happen to you. I know what happened to Ty. Mike had 2 possible choices in his life, but they weren't choices that you could make yourself. We, the industry, was driving this choice for Mike. Now, my journeyman, the same thing were happening to you. You're either going to go into a skilled trade within industrial unions. You're going to go into a factory. Now, I want you to remember, you're all carpenters. I have 5 carpenters here who worked for somebody who owned a shop who made wooden products, a wheat thrasher. Now we're going into a factory. I'm going to make wheat thrashers out of all kinds of material, and I can mass produce them. In that factory, I have employed what? Thousands of people. In our shop before, I had 6 people in this room. So one possibility for Mike is, and all the rest of you, you're going to become a skilled trade. You'll still practice your trade, but in a larger environment. And boy, did that sure change the power arrangement. Or you could have kept and gone into the construction industry, eventually as it developed out, building buildings and things like that. And how was this choice made? Well, it wasn't an easy one. Mike might have said, well, versus building wonderful, small, beautiful wooden things, maybe building buildings is okay for me. Maybe I'll be a rough carpenter. Maybe I'll be a skilled carpenter building beautiful houses and buildings and whatever. Or maybe I'm pissed off. Maybe I'll just go into the factory. Besides, I think the factory may pay a little more money. So there were choices, but they were forced choices. And now you're starting to go down in it. Well, there's other destructions that will happen. And I'm going to take you all the way to today. When we take a look at choice A was construction. What happened there? Let's assume, Yvonne, that you basically, as a journeyman carpenter, went to construction, okay? You ended up with 4 possibilities. You could have worked for a non-union company. Now, you just came out of a total union environment where the scarcity of the skill was so important to you for power, for purposes of your economic well-being. Now, you're going to go into a non-union company. Well, I'm not going to pay as much. Why should I? You have no union to protect you. Sorry. Now, you could have gone to what we call a double-breasted company. Do we still see those? Oh, yeah. They have 2 companies. They run side by side. One union, one non-union. So when the contractor wants to bid on a project, what can they do? This depends what they need. But some other horrible things happened. And Jessica, this is for you. You went into prefab construction. Yeah, it's really too bad. Now, yeah, I mean, you got yours first, lady. She went into prefab construction. Up in northern Michigan, there's a very famous bridge called the UWWA Bridge. Now, why is it famous for us in Michigan? Because it collapsed slightly one day. And you probably heard about it. They used a Dutch technique of taking, what were they? They were 102-ton slabs that they propelled out on a girder, dropped them in the cement. This bridge is actually cemented together with glue. And fortunately, it didn't drop all the way down. Fortunately, no one was hurt, but it scared the hell out of a lot of my friends who were skilled craftsmen who got caught inside of the hollowed-out bridge when it went. Now, what we don't know about, and people don't know about, is that bridge was built in a factory. In a factory, if you go north in Michigan on Interstate 75, you'll eventually go over the UWWA Bridge, and if you look at the right, you'll see an old building there. And it's like an old factory. Now, well, I think Lafarge, the cement company, now owns it. And they built that bridge there. They built the sections inside of there with what? Unskilled work. They put it on a trailer, they hauled that sucker up to the top, they hooked it up to the girder, they propelled it over there, and they hoped it fit. Well, one day it didn't. Maybe that tells me about lack of skill, I don't know. Sorry, times have changed.